Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 779 of People Behind the Science. Today, we're excited to be revisiting our interview with Dr. Sterling Nesbitt. Listeners, Sterling is a vertebrate paleontologist who leverages his training in biology to understand how animals are related, how they evolved certain features, and how they've diversified over time. He's working to improve our knowledge of how life on Earth has evolved over the past hundreds of millions of years. And in this interview, Sterling shares stories from his life and research. So I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. I am excited to be joined on the show today by Dr. Sterling Nesbitt. So, Sterling, welcome to our show. How are you?
I am fantastic this morning.
Excellent. I am fantastic as well. And I'm excited to chat with you more about your life and your science, but I do want to take a moment here to introduce you to our listeners first. So, listeners, Sterling is currently an assistant professor of geosciences at Virginia Tech. He received his bachelor's in integrative biology from the University of California, Berkeley, and he went on to complete his master's and PhD in geosciences at Columbia University. Afterwards, Sterling conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Washington, and the Field Museum before joining the faculty at Virginia Tech, where he is today. And Sterling is the recipient of the 2016 Virginia Tech College Award for Outreach Excellence from the College of Science, which I think is absolutely awesome. And Sterling is here with us today to talk about his research and tell us about his experiences in life and science. So, Sterling, we want to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also just as a regular person. So can you start by telling us what you do with your time when you're not doing science?
I'm doing science a lot of times, so it's integrated completely into my life. And as part of that, where I'm not completely thinking about science the entire time, what I really love to do is travel and see the world that we live in. So not only does it help me think about what I want to do, but it also just helps me connect with what's out there across our entire globe.
Absolutely. And I know as a paleontologist, you do quite a bit of field work where you're traveling all over the place. So that's great opportunities to combine those passions of your work and this travel.
Yeah, definitely. When we go to Tanzania or the Gobi in Mongolia to look for some of the neatest fossils, I spend a lot of time understanding the culture that I see, all the different traditions. It's just really fantastic to see what else is out there. In the United States, we just have this small subsample of what's out there in this world. So you really get to experience the whole thing when you go all over.
Definitely. I know I'm a travel enthusiast myself, and it's kind of fun to get outside your comfort zone and outside of things you normally do.
Definitely. Traveling, not staying at the best hotels, hiking around, finding the smallest hotels, the smallest restaurants, really open your eyes to see how the other parts of the world work outside the United States.
Definitely. So now we kind of hinted at your work here in your last response, but can you tell me how you describe your work to someone who's not at all familiar with your field?
Sure. I would be officially labeled as a vertebrate paleontologist, but I've been trained broadly as a biologist who incorporates lots of extinct animals to understand how animals are related today, how they evolved features, and how they diversified through time. So really it's being a detective of understanding how life has evolved and shown up all across the planet through a very long time scale. We're talking tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of years.
Gotcha. So do you have a favorite animal, past or present?
That one's tough. I get asked this a lot. And most people assume it's a dinosaur, but sometimes I tell them it's something no one else has heard of. But I'm a fan of an entire group of organisms called archosaurs. And this is the group that contains birds and crocodiles today, but also extinct groups such as pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, and of course dinosaurs. So it's not one animal, but it's an entire group of animals that are still around today.
It's almost like you're cheating with that answer because you're picking a little bit of everything there. No.
It's a very small subset of the tree of life, but
That's right.
Those are some of the animals that I'm really interested in.
Well, very cool to hear more about your work. And I know we'll talk more about specific projects as we go through our conversation today. But I do want to talk about what motivates you. I think there's so much to get done in the life of a scientist. Things can get hectic with travel and work and research and everything. So can you tell me what motivates you? And do you have maybe a favorite saying or phrase that you use to keep yourself going?
I don't really have a favorite phrase, but just the word explore, whether it's today, whether it's traveling to see different parts of the world or understanding different cultures or just seeing places that no one else has seen, to thinking about the past, Earth's past, animals' past, that we can only find by going out, walking around, looking for fossils. And one thing that's so amazing being a paleontologist is that when you find one of these fossils, whether it's just a piece of bone or a complete skeleton of an animal, whether it's a new species or not, you may be the first person to ever touch or even glance at an extinct animal that may represent hundreds of thousands of generations. It's a pretty incredible feeling when you're the first person to realize that the animal in front of you might be the only evidence that animal or that group that it belongs to ever existed. So I would say explore is my favorite word to say, and that's what I teach undergraduates at Virginia Tech, graduate students, and postdocs. Just get out there and explore.
Well, I love it. Sort of that invigorating sense of adventure, getting out, seeing the world and observing and everything. I think that's fantastic and a great motivating force. And I'm curious now, you talked about this experience of going out there and finding a fossil maybe for the first time. Have you had any false alarms, or did it take a little while to develop that eye to know it was something special?
Definitely. And one of the most common questions I get is, how did you see that fossil? If you're walking around somewhere in Blacksburg or somewhere in a city, there's so many distractions. You look on the ground, there's all kinds of rocks, all different colors, all different shapes. Well, if you were to find a fossil in that environment, it would be very difficult. But it's funny because when we're out in the Gobi or in Tanzania or Arizona looking for fossils, they're a lot easier to spot than most people think, because most of the sediment there all looks the same. Like you're either in sand or in rocks that are all about the same color, or white sandstones that are just eroding very slowly. And the bone itself is actually usually very brightly colored. So it's either white, which looks like bone today, or it's blue or purple or yellow. So it actually stands out pretty well. So you just walk around and look for these little fragments of bone. And when you see these little fragments of bone, hopefully there's more of a specimen either still in the ground or there are other specimens close to that area. So it's actually not as hard as most people think when they're looking at the world outside of what they know. But when we get out in the field, it becomes a lot easier than most people think.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for these tips and tricks for amateur fossil hunters like myself. I love it. So now, Sterling, I want to hear about where this interest in science and dinosaurs and extinct creatures and evolution of life all began. Was there a particular memory that you can think of in your childhood where this spark was lit for you?
A lot of people ask me because so many people grow up with dinosaurs in their lives or extinct animals. And I think it stems from just being amazed by these great large animals that you really can't see anymore. We see their descendants, but they don't look exactly like they do today. Like birds and crocodiles don't exactly look like a giant T-Rex. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people have a keen interest when they're very small, usually between 2 and 6 years old. And a lot of people grow out of this interest in dinosaurs when they get into grade school. Some people hold on for a very long time, and some people get very lucky so they can study these animals. I actually wasn't super interested in dinosaurs when I was 6 or 7. I got very interested in archaeology, so I've always been very interested in reconstructing the past with what you can find in the ground, whether it be 50 years old or 500 million years old. I was always interested in interpreting those clues that are left by various forms of life.
Interesting.
I did grow out of that initial dinosaur and extinct reptile kind of binge when I was very little. And I didn't really come back to paleontology, so non-human fossils, through a much longer time scale till I was in, I would say, junior high. And what really catalyzed my interest in paleontology was the Mesa Southwest Museum in Mesa, Arizona, and it's now known as the Arizona Museum of Natural History. And that museum has fossils from all over Arizona. I grew up in Phoenix, and there are fossils all over Arizona. And this museum studies them, and they go out and find them and bring them back for exhibits and research. I was lucky enough to be part of that museum. We would always have a Tuesday night fossil night where Bob McCord, who is the curator of paleontology there, would give a short talk about fossils from Arizona from various times, and then we would sit down and prepare fossils. So we would take the rock off of the fossils, which is a very important process because these fossils don't come out of the ground clean. And while you're sitting there taking grain by grain off some of these fossils, you really get to see these fossils in a new light. You might be the first one to see a part of a bone that no one's ever seen. So that's where I got really interested. And in 1997, I was 15, a discovery of a mammoth occurred in the Phoenix Basin. I read this in the newspaper, and I begged my parents, we got to go see this thing. Mm-hmm. It was in the middle of a field because it was a housing development, and someone had trenched through a mammoth tusk. So while they were digging this trench, pieces of mammoth tusk ivory were spread everywhere. And this is a common occurrence. This is how you find something. Mm-hmm. When you find something, you usually break it. And that's how you see something different.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. So I begged my parents. I was like, we got to go out. I didn't have my license yet. So we did. And while I was at the site, scientists from ASU, Arizona State University, were down in the trench, expanding it, trying to find more of this mammoth, and luckily there was more. But there was this pile of dirt next to what they were digging in, and I looked over, and there was part of a mammoth tooth. And I didn't actually know it was a mammoth tooth, but I knew it was a fossil. And I picked it up and took it over to the Arizona State University scientists and said, hey, I think this is part of a mammoth tooth that was in the discard pile. This looks very interesting. And they said, whoa, we need to go back through this entire discard pile because they hadn't found that piece of the mammoth yet. And what was really neat was they said, do you want to stay?
That's awesome.
And at that time, it was July in Phoenix in a hole. So it was about 110 degrees every day.
You can politely decline, right?
Yeah, and that wasn't an option, of course.
Right.
So I stayed for the next week and a half while they were finishing up the excavation. That was my first field experience, and since that summer, I've been looking for fossils every summer since 1997.
Well, that is a phenomenal story, Sterling. I love that you had this eye for fossils, even back then as a 15-year-old, and it sounds like you haven't lost the touch. So now tell us next, you decided that this was an area that you were really passionate about. What guided your decisions in terms of where to go next?
What really helped me choose my career path was after this mammoth was found, I knew this was something that I wanted to do professionally, not just go find fossils, but understand the biology of these extinct organisms. Now, we know a lot about mammoths and mastodon. These animals are only a few tens of thousands of years old, and they're found all over the United States. I wanted to target something we knew a lot less about. And luckily, those rocks were in Arizona. These rocks, which is a set of rocks that includes Petrified Forest National Park, are about 200 to 240 million years old in a time just about the time dinosaurs start to take over the planet. And its fauna were very different at the time. All the continents were together at this time. They all formed the supercontinent Pangaea. And North America was much closer to the equator. It was pretty much on the equator during the Triassic period. And the Triassic period is when you have some of the first large reptiles, but we don't know that much about the evolution of these earliest large reptiles. So this was a time that I was really interested in. So I started looking for fossils in northern Arizona, and I was lucky to find some. So this was the early days of the internet. So I started contacting scientists that I could find at universities. And one of those scientists was Kevin Padian at the University of California, Berkeley. Kevin was fantastic. He didn't say much, but he said, "Why don't you come up to Berkeley and show me what you found?" So I remember traveling to Berkeley, to the San Francisco Bay Area for the first time with a box of fossils.
Amazing.
On bark. And I took them to Kevin in his lab, and he was fantastic. He gave me a book about the early evolution of these kinds of animals, and he said, "You should apply to Berkeley." And I did, and I got in. So that's what really catalyzed what I wanted to do. It really gave me a clear picture. This is what I wanted to do for my career.
Well, I love this image, too, of you traveling with this box of random fossils you had found to the university and then getting that invitation to apply. I think having these conversations with scientists, connecting with someone in a field that you're passionate about is a really great way to kind of get a foot in the door and make it happen. So for listeners out there, definitely don't be afraid to reach out to these scientists. They're often very excited to meet with you.
Exactly.
So now you went to Columbia next. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience or some of the postdoctoral experiences you had next?
My experiences at Columbia and my postdoctoral experience have really framed my career. At Columbia, I got extensive training in how to conduct research, and I was able to travel all over the world to try to understand the early evolution of the common ancestor of birds and crocodiles and early dinosaurs. So that was a time that really showed me what I had to do to be a valid researcher, to really go out and explore the world, think out of the box, think about these animals like no one else has been able to. But it also showed me that you just can't look at specimens that have already been found. You have to find new specimens. You have to target specific times and make predictions about which animals would be there. Then you have to go out and try to find them. And once in a while you do. And that's what I learned at Columbia is it's predictable. It's predictable where certain organisms should be based on time and place. And if you can find the right rocks, you can go out there and find the right kind of animals to answer your questions. My postdoctoral experiences showed me how to prepare to be a scientist to run in a research lab. So my experiences at the University of Texas and at the University of Washington really showed me that now that I had a pretty good idea of how to conduct science, how to ask questions, it taught me how to share that knowledge with undergraduate students and graduate students and really get them started on their career paths.
Definitely. And I know you spent a short time at the Field Museum as well, we mentioned. Were you in sort of a traditional postdoctoral position or was it a little bit different?
It's a little bit different at the Field Museum. I was what's called the Meeker postdoc. So I wrote about a project and that was accepted. And that project concentrated on reptile evolution from a few sites in Madagascar. So there I was able to see how a museum worked. Museums are quite different than an academic environment, but there are some certain overlaps. So there it really showed me what it's like to work in a museum. What are the challenges? What are some of the great benefits versus an academic job? So that really showed me the path to either a more museum-based job or an academic job. And the best thing about my postdoctoral research experience at all these fantastic places all around the U.S. was that it really allowed me to see the best of these programs and take all of that and repackage it for when I would be an advisor at Virginia Tech for undergraduates and graduate students.
Gotcha. And throughout this story, you've hinted at some of the people along the way who may have had a big impact on you. So Sterling, can you tell us, did you have particular role models that really stand out in your mind as helping you get to where you are today? Or did you have mentors as well who may have done the same?
Definitely. I would not be anywhere near where I am now without very strong mentorship. Specifically, Kevin Padian set me on my path when I was an undergraduate. I started in his lab a week before my freshman year started at Berkeley, and I continued all the way through to when I graduated in 2004. Paul Olson and Mark Norell at Columbia and the American Museum of Natural History were huge influences on just not how I conducted science, but how I thought about science. And then, of course, my postdoctoral mentors, Julia Clark, Christian Sidor, and Ken and Jill Zick at the Field Museum were huge influences on how to think about science and how to move a research question forward and how to mentor other students.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like you've had so many great people at these different critical stages in your career and in your development as a scientist. And I think that's so important. And I think so far we've talked about the grand adventure that's taken you now to where you are today at Virginia Tech. But I want to hear a little bit more about one of these projects you have going on right now that you are really, really excited to be doing. So can you give us some detail?
So just when we think we know a lot about a certain extinct group, you usually discover something that does not fit into that original model. And that's where I am right now with understanding the origins of early dinosaurs and their early evolution. So dinosaurs had a very long history. The big dinosaurs were around for 180 million years, and they continue as birds today. But their beginnings are much more shrouded in mystery. Early dinosaurs were quite small. They were only about 6 or 7 feet long, and most of that was tail. And these dinosaurs all show up around 230 million years ago. But what I've been studying, what I continue to study, is that rise and what dinosaurs are really closely related to. They're related to a variety of these groups we know very little about. Most of these names no one's ever heard of, so I won't get into those.
Sure.
But they look like dinosaurs. They just don't share all the physical features dinosaurs share a little bit later in time. So most of these animals are very small. Sometimes they're called bunny crocs because they have very, very long legs, but they're not bunnies, and they're not crocodiles. But they look like tiny, upright lizard bunnies, essentially.
I'm going to have to look up some pictures of the reconstructions of these. These sound amazing.
This is a larger group that includes dinosaurs called dinosauromorphs or dinosaur forms. They look like dinosaurs, but they don't share all the features, so we know they're close relatives, just like we know that chimpanzees are close relatives of humans because we share a lot of features, but we don't share all our features. So these early relatives of dinosaurs were way more diverse than anyone expected. They just have a really terrible fossil record. But since we started recognizing them in the 70s and then a huge push in the mid-2000s, it turns out these animals were everywhere, and they had all these fantastic shapes and all these different diets that we never would have predicted based on early dinosaur evolution. So this is where I find dinosaur evolution and the origin of dinosaurs, where they actually came from, very, very interesting. And because there are so many new fossils, it's really helping us understand what we don't understand. That dinosaurs weren't this great force when they appeared 230 million years ago. They were just part of a bigger group that was diversifying during the Triassic. It's not till about 30 million years later that dinosaurs really take over the world. So this image of dinosaurs just being this dominant force is more of a story later in the Mesozoic or later in the Cretaceous. These giant dinosaurs had a long evolutionary history that started out with kind of a whimper. And that's what I find really exciting.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned that these things were everywhere, but I know obviously not everywhere is a great place to find or harvest these kinds of fossils that are 230 million years old. So where are you primarily looking?
Yeah, I use everywhere in a very loose sense. The fossil record and the rock record is very patchy. So this is what makes my job very interesting. So 230, 240 million years ago, the world had just one massive landmass called Pangaea. I mentioned it before. So dinosaurs and their closest relatives could get almost to any part of the world without crossing any major barrier that we know about. So now that all the continents are split apart, those fossils are distributed across the world. When I'm studying the early evolution of dinosaurs and their closest relatives, I get to travel to Argentina, to Brazil, to Africa, to Europe, to Asia. Haven't made it to Australia yet, but there are fossils on almost all these continents from this time. So it's really amazing that I get to go see these fossils in places that I had never been before.
Absolutely. And I know we've talked about travel now a couple times throughout our conversation. I think this is one of the fantastic aspects of careers in science, this ability to see different places across the world, to experience the cultures. And Sterling, if you had to pick one place that you've been and mark it as your absolute favorite, what would that place be and why?
That's an easy question. It's Tanzania for me. Tanzania opened up my eyes, not just scientifically, but culturally. And it's so different from the United States in some ways that it just really opened up my eyes to lots of new experiences that you just can't have in the United States. And I spent a lot of time in Tanzania looking for fossils in places that tourists do not go. We don't have the huge megafauna like elephants and lions in the place we are, but we see this part of Africa very differently than places like you see in the national parks, the classic Africa. A lot of those places don't actually exist anymore, and it's more patchy, just like our fossil distribution. So I've been to places that most people haven't in Tanzania, and that's just really influenced how I see the world and how I conduct my science.
Definitely. So can you tell us what it's like doing fieldwork in Tanzania? Are you just sort of looking for fossils and digging holes, or do you have a site where things are reliably coming up?
Tanzania was one of those iconoclasts for me because most of what I was used to was walking around in deserts, places with very few plants, which means you have lots of rocks exposed. And when you have lots of rocks exposed, you usually have lots of fossils lying on the ground. As we got to Tanzania, as we got closer and closer to where fossils had been found in the 1930s, this picture dramatically changed because everything is covered in grass and plants in Tanzania. There are a few places that have rocks exposed, and those are the places we find fossils, but finding those rocks is very difficult. So we actually turned to Google Earth to look at this area before we even step foot on the ground to look for these little patches of rocks. We GPSed them from Google Earth, and then we're able to walk through the grass, which is 7 to 10 feet tall out there.
Oh, wow. I don't think you can call it grass at that point.
Yeah,
Right.
They call it elephant grass or buffalo grass.
Gotcha.
Depending on where we are, because that's the animals that it could hide.
Right.
It's an incredible, eye-opening experience when you get on the ground and you have to stand on a truck just to see a few feet over the grass. It's absolutely amazing, but it makes it very difficult to find fossils. So with these GPS points that we picked from Google Earth, we just kind of make a tunnel through the grass and go to those points. And when we do find these rocks, we find a lot of incredible fossils. Fossils from the earliest age of reptiles, the Mesozoic, and we find some close relatives of dinosaurs and other animals that survived these huge mass extinctions. It's just a very interesting place to work.
So now when you're out there, do you predominantly do day trips, or are you actually out there staying on a field site?
We stay up to about 2 to 3 weeks in villages in that area. Because there's so much grass, we don't actually stay on site, so we drive to the sites. But we stay in these villages, usually near a soccer field and the school, and we interact with the people that live in those villages on a daily basis. And during the evening, or right as we get back from conducting field work all day, there's usually a soccer game going on, and it's a really fun environment to be in.
Well, that's awesome. And I love hearing these stories about fieldwork. I think it sounds so adventurous, so exciting to be out there gathering the science firsthand from the ground, these fossils that you're absolutely right, people have never seen before. So phenomenal to hear more about it. But I think we've so far hit a lot of the highlights of your career, and we haven't yet talked about some of the challenges and the struggles and the downsides. And I know there are some in every scientist's career. So Sterling, I want you to tell us about a story of maybe one of your own failures or challenges that you faced and how you worked your way through that tough situation.
Thinking about some of my failures, and maybe I don't see them as failures, but maybe pivots. When something doesn't work, you just pivot and you approach it a different way. And I can relate to this by specifically speaking about trying to find fossils. So as I mentioned before, the fossil record is very poor. Overall, it gives us a very tiny percentage of what actually happened in the past. So we have to be very choosy as paleontologists because we don't have infinite funds and infinite time to target certain areas. We have to go in with maps and try to find fossils to answer our questions in areas that we pick that we think would be the best to understand the evolution of dinosaurs or the evolution of different reptile groups. So there's actually a lot of failures in terms of trying to go and find fossils. And that's if you get to these field sites. And I've tried to reach field sites that are just impossible to get to without helicopters. So you modify your questions sometimes. And once you get out to the field, you have to just spend the time looking for these fossils. And sometimes you don't find much. Actually, most of the time, you don't find very many fossils. So through the years, I've been able to hone my fossil finding skills and also how I ask questions to a lot of these early failures of, all right, let's go to these rocks, see if we can find something. And when you get out there and you don't find anything, you start finding patterns in where the fossils should be preserved. So you don't look in certain rocks. You have a new search strategy. You don't spend your time just randomly walking around out there. You have to have a targeted search strategy. And when you find a fossil, hopefully, which is still pretty rare, especially of vertebrate animals, you excavate them in a very particular way so you can protect them from damages from actually excavating them or traveling with these specimens and bringing them back to the lab to study. So there's been lots of little failures that are related to this, but if you just pivot, then you can figure out how to do it better in the future.
Definitely. And can you remember a particular time maybe when you went out in the field, you were so excited about finding something in particular and it just wasn't there or you really couldn't find it?
It actually happens all the time, but you might find something else. You might find a group you weren't expecting to. And this happens all the time, especially when you go through what I call the fieldwork drought part of the year, which is pretty much the last day of fieldwork sometime in August until next May. So you get really excited about doing fieldwork. And then when you get out there again, you realize, oh, wait, this might be hard.
Right.
It's not exactly the way it goes in your head while you're teaching or doing non-fieldwork research. So it happens all the time. And yeah, a lot of times you don't find anything, but once in a while you do.
Certainly. And I know it's probably hard for students to prepare them for this situation of, okay, you have this idea, you have this project, we have this whole wonderful plan of how this is going to go. How do you get students to not get too frustrated or disappointed?
It's difficult sometimes. The second they find a fossil that they're interested in, it's no problem after that.
Nothing else matters. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. So as soon as they find something themselves and they get that experience of, I'm the first person to ever see evidence of this animal that's ever existed, it doesn't matter anymore. It's like, let's do this again.
Right.
I don't care if I fail. I will try so I can get to that point again.
Absolutely.
And then that's just the beginning part. And then they get to study those bones and really understand what they mean and how they fit in to the evolution of life and our planet.
Fantastic. Well, great to hear about some of the challenges that you face in your field and how you overcome them. We don't just want to talk about your tough times, Sterling. Can you tell us next a story of success, one of these big moments that meant a lot to you?
I would say that would have to do with fieldwork too. So there's definitely a theme. Fieldwork is extremely important to what I do as a scientist because that's how I collect data. So finding one of those animals that you spend weeks or months or years predicting based on what we know of how other animals are related and the age of the rock. Like, for example, the early relatives of birds and crocodiles and dinosaurs are very rare, and there just aren't that many fossils of them anywhere in the world. It's a huge gap in our knowledge, but I was determined as an undergrad to go try to fill this gap. And you can make all the predictions you want from what we have today, both living and fossils that are already in museums. But until you actually find one of these early relatives of birds and crocodiles and dinosaurs, you just don't know all the details. So this was a grand challenge that I was so happy to take on. And I knew the age of the rocks that these animals should be in. So probably one of the greatest successes that I've ever had, which really started my career, was to find one of these animals in a place where people had just found just fragments of these kinds of animals. By fragments, I mean just part of a skull bone or part of a leg bone, which gives us a very limited picture, but we were able to find much of a skeleton of an animal. So Arizonosaurus had been known since 1940, but no one had found more than just a piece of the upper jaw. Mm-hmm. So less than 1% of this animal was known, but we knew that it fit close to the base of the tree of life of dinosaurs, crocodiles, and birds. So Arizonosaurus was predicted to be one of these close relatives. We would call it an early archosaur, so it's not a dinosaur, it's pre-dinosaurs. So very little was known about this animal, but we knew it was there and it could be found in Arizona. And the fossils from this particular rock unit, which is called the Moenkopi Formation, which is located in northern Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, was famous for producing very scrappy fossils, just isolated bones or fragments of bones. So I was determined to get out there and try to find more of Arizonosaurus. And in 2002, we did. I was part of a very small team that I was leading my first expedition. So I think there were 3 of us. Mm-hmm. And we found the skeleton, not just a fragment, but we found the skull and we found the backbone and we found the pelvis of this animal, Arizonosaurus.
Oh, wow.
And there were some huge surprises. We would have never predicted from that small piece of jaw that Arizonosaurus had a huge sail on its back, just like the famous relative of mammals, Dimetrodon, or the very famous dinosaur, Spinosaurus. We would have never known that without finding most of the skeleton. So that right there was probably my favorite story of success so far.
Well, that is amazing. And I love the name Arizonosaurus. That's fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing this story of success. So can you tell me, when you started finding these pieces, what was going through your mind?
It was a mix of shock and excitement and a little bit of worry. The shock, because we had found something that we could find, but I wasn't expecting to at all. The excitement, because we had found it and I had put so much work into getting to that point, and it was paying off. Every second we were brushing a little bit more rock off the bones of Arizonosaurus. The worry was, okay, now we found this thing. Now we have to get it out of the ground safely.
Right. Don't break it. Yeah.
And this is the only specimen that's ever been found of this animal.
Wow.
And not only is it the only new specimen of Arizonosaurus, but it was part of a larger group of reptiles that was only known by a few other fragments around the world. So it worried me a little bit, but the excitement definitely took over. You have to be very patient out there. You can't uncover all the bones. You want to protect them with the rock around them. You cover them in plaster, thick enough that it protects all the bones, but not thick enough that it gets too big and too heavy to move. Then you have to drag it out of there and get it to a lab. So it was this mix of nervousness and excitement, but it's one of those feelings or sets of feelings that are really hard to recreate unless you're in that situation. But I've been lucky enough to have that set of emotions quite a few times, especially with the discovery of these new kinds of reptiles and relatives of dinosaurs and dinosaurs themselves.
Definitely. And I understand it's not necessarily just going out in the field to collect these new species, but sometimes you make completely new discoveries by looking through old collections and pieces and things that people have already found. And I understand you had one of these experiences as a graduate student, unearthing a treasure at the museum there. So can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, so more than half the discoveries in paleontology, or at least vertebrate paleontology, happen not in the field, but well after fossils have been collected. And this really shows the importance of museums. Museums are libraries for fossils. You can come back again and again to study the same fossils that have been found for 100 years, 30 years, 20 years. So you can reinterpret what people have said before in these libraries of fossils, but you can also find lots of new species that might be there that no one had time to look at before. And this is what happened when I was a graduate student at Columbia, and I spent a lot of time at the American Museum of Natural History, one of the greatest museums in the world, and they collected fossils starting in the late 1800s. And because they collected so many fossils, they hadn't had time to go through all of these fossils that were collected, and some of them still were captured in these plaster jackets that you use to take these fossils out from the field. So as a graduate student, I started exploring these fossil jackets that had never been opened. And through about 2 months of opening these small little plaster jackets from the time of early dinosaur evolution, about 210 million years ago, I was able to find pieces of an animal that everyone thought might have been a dinosaur, but is actually more closely related to crocodiles that are living today. And it took 2 to 3 months to find all the parts of this animal because they were spread out in lots of different chunks of rock that were collected in the 1940s. And I was missing the skull, and I had no idea if it was there or not, but I had an idea of where it could be in one of these fossil jackets. Unfortunately, this fossil jacket that I was looking for has been misplaced.
Oh, no.
So I looked all over the museum. I remember I was in collections Halloween night, basically crawling over these plaster jackets, some of them that weigh up to tons and are half the size of a car.
Oh, wow.
Looking for just a tiny little number labeled on it with the year, and I wasn't able to find it. So it took another month and a half before I gave up. And I didn't exactly give up. I just had other things to do. I was like, wait, maybe it doesn't even exist anymore.
Right.
But someone said, we have found a chunk of rock that you may be looking for. It's been misplaced. It was placed with mammoth fossils in a part of the museum I'd even consider looking. And I was so excited that I ran down the stairs to see this chunk of rock. And what I saw was truly amazing. Someone had prepared the top of the plaster jacket and exposed the bones in this chunk of rock. And I was able to see that there was the skull of this animal upside down. You could only see the lower jaws, but I knew right away that was the skull of the animal that had been sitting at the American Museum of Natural History for over 70 years.
Oh, wow. That is amazing.
And through getting the skull and those other parts I found earlier, I had about 70% of the skeleton of this animal, and it really helped solve a great mystery whether this animal was a dinosaur or a close relative of a crocodile. And it turns out it had lots of characters of dinosaurs, like it had a beak, it had no teeth, and was bipedal, but it was more closely related to a crocodile than to what was typically thought to be related to dinosaurs.
Well, Sterling, I could listen all day to your stories of amazing discoveries. This is phenomenal. And I think along the way, you've talked about some of the people that you've worked with at these different field sites, the people you've been able to interact with over the course of your career. And I think in addition to these amazing discoveries, the people are also what makes science so wonderful. And I think there's a lot of different personalities and oftentimes quirky traditions develop. And I love sharing these stories as well with our listeners, because I think there are so many different types of scientists, and oftentimes things are contrary to the stereotypes that are out there. So do you have a story you can share with us today that really shows this human side of science?
So our lab here at Virginia Tech, our vertebrate paleo research group, always goes out to the field together during the summer. And not only do we go out, I go out on other expeditions, but part of why I choose a field site is not because it might be the best place to find fossils. It's driven by awesome food.
Ooh.
So we choose field locations sometimes, or we keep going back to field localities because of the food that you can get around it. And some of the examples I can use have to do with our field work in the United States. So we work on a fossil site in northern New Mexico almost every year. We've done 11 years of field work in this area, but we have our favorite restaurants all around this area. And in this way, this kind of field work isn't the classic paleontologist doing field work in the middle of the Gobi Desert or a giant desert with just a canteen of water. It's pretty cushy field work. So we stay at a campground, and luckily the fossils are very close to accommodations. But we also drive into town to all our favorite restaurants. And in northern New Mexico, you have a fantastic variety of northern New Mexico food, which is pretty unique in the United States. So lots of green chilies and lots of lamb. So we go to those same places. And not only do we go to those same places in northern New Mexico, but we have to get to New Mexico. So we have our favorite stops across I-40 from Virginia to New Mexico that we stop at every year for food. And that includes some fantastic barbecue and fried chicken in Nashville, and just lots and lots of fantastic food that you just can't get in Virginia all the time. So there's definitely a connection between the field sites that I pick and research questions, but also what kind of cultures I can experience. And the way that we best experience a lot of these different cultures is through food.
I love it. So if you had to pick one place, where is the place to eat in northern New Mexico?
I would narrow it down to traditional northern New Mexico food. It's located in a tiny little town called El Rito. The restaurant is called El Farolitos, and every year we take the field crew to this restaurant, which seats maybe 15 people, and we fill the whole thing. And I would like to say I've tried a lot of different items on the menu, but I don't think that's true. I think I just get the same thing every time because it's so good.
Yeah, you know what you like. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly. But that's an experience that our lab group shares every year with other lab groups that we work with closely in this tiny little restaurant in El Rito, New Mexico.
Well, that is phenomenal. If I ever make it out there, I'm going to put this on my itinerary of places to go. And now, Sterling, we've talked about some of the amazing experiences you've had as a scientist, and I know there's a lot of work to do. You spend a lot of your time reading literature, and sometimes it's hard to escape the literature to read a book for fun, but I love getting book recommendations from everyone we have on our program. So do you have a book that you've read either recently or long ago that you really enjoyed and want to pass on to our listeners?
I would say the biggest influence on me over the last 10 years or so that has to do with paleontology is a book that was written by Neil Shubin called Your Inner Fish. And Your Inner Fish goes through the story of how we become human, basically. Where do our features come from? And how do our features, our five-fingered hand, our backbones, what our bodies are made of in terms of how lots of different animals on our planet share some of those histories. So it reconstructs essentially who we are anatomically and how we're related to animals all across the planet. And that book just doesn't talk about paleontology. It talks about biology and chemistry and neurobiology. So it's a very integrative look at why what I do is important. And it really shows where we are as humans and where we've come from.
Definitely. Well, excellent recommendation. And I know you're into fish. I've had a couple people mention it before. It really does tackle some of these big questions in evolution. And I love talking about the big questions on this show and asking people, if you had everything, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, anything you could dream of that you might want, what question would you want to answer yourself, Sterling?
I would really be interested in understanding how mass extinctions reshape our world. And we know a lot about mass extinctions, especially the one that takes out the biggest dinosaurs 65 million years ago. But we know a lot less about the transitions from the Triassic to the Jurassic period about 200 million years ago. We just have a pretty terrible fossil record, and we don't have a good understanding of how the world recovers after this mass extinction. What we do know is the world is pretty alien before in terms of the kinds of animals you would see on the landscape. So 220 million years ago is completely unique. There are vestiges and there are slight similarities to what we see today. But after this end Triassic extinction, the world becomes much more familiar. You get frogs and turtles, and you get dinosaurs, which we see today as birds, but the world itself looks a lot more familiar. So I'm really interested in how that transition happened and how fast it happened. So how fast did it take our planet to heal from changes in CO2 and heat during this time? And how did animals react? How did they diversify? And these are some of the big questions that surround, hopefully, a trajectory in my career that I'll be able to answer a few of these questions.
Definitely. And I think it's going to be so hard to put that big picture together when all you have are these little bits and pieces and snippets from all different places in the world. And now we've talked a little bit about some of the people that you've encountered over the course of your career. And you mentioned some of these mentors, some of these inspirational figures that you've had who've helped you along your own journey. And I'm curious, was there a piece of advice that you can recall that really helped you that you can pass on to our listeners today to help them on their own journeys?
There's one quote that stuck with me that I tell every student that I mentor. And it doesn't come from a paleontologist. It comes from a geologist. It was a professor I had at the University of California, Berkeley, named Dr. Brimhall. And I took his class, which was centered on geological mapping, which is an important part to help me find fossils. But one thing has always stuck with me. He said, always know what's under your feet. And for some reason, that's really stuck with me. And it doesn't always have to do with rocks. He was referring to as always know which rocks you're standing on so you can understand the structure of the rocks underneath your feet and what it looks like under the ground. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it is more understand where you are at a certain place and time and just stop to think about where you're standing. Look around. Understand the world around you. So I always tell my students, always know what's under your feet.
I like it. And I think so many of us tend to have this very heavy forward-looking vision, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about all these things we have to do that we don't appreciate where we are exactly at that moment right now. So fantastic piece of advice to pass on to our listeners. Is there any other last piece of advice you want to leave them with or a last note of inspiration you'd like to end our conversation on today?
I would go back to what we talked about in the beginning in this interview is what drives me. And that's just the simple word explore. Whether it's today, understanding what's happening around the world today through cultures or just landscapes, to what's happening in the past. So we have a very rich history on this planet, and it can be explored.
Fantastic, Sterling. Well, listeners, definitely take this advice to heart. Get out there and explore the world. And Sterling, can you tell our listeners if they want to explore more about what you do in your work or learn more about you, where should they go?
So we have a very active Twitter account, and it's called VTech Meets Paleo. And this Twitter account chronicles what we do in the field sometimes, what we do in the lab, discoveries that we make. But you can also find me just by Googling me and finding the Virginia Tech Paleo Group website. And in that website, you can see some of the questions we're interested in and some of the discoveries that we've been making and some tidbits about the questions that we'll be addressing in the near future. So we're always finding fossils. Sometimes it takes years and years to actually get to those fossils, but we're always exploring. And we have lots of updates on our Twitter account and this website through the university.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely follow Sterling's group on Twitter and check out that website. And Sterling, thank you so much for joining us on the program and sharing a piece of your story.
Thank you. It's been really fun.
It was a joy to hear your stories. And listeners, thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.